A man built a house for a woman he had never met. Two rocking chairs on the porch. One for him. One for her. Whoever she turned out to be. The neighbors said he'd lost his mind. The winter said he'd lose his life. And the woman, somewhere in an eastern city with ink-stained fingers and a father who was dying, said nothing at all, because she hadn't read his letter yet. This is the story of what happens when one stubborn man refuses to stop believing, and one exhausted woman finally allows herself to want something. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The first thing people noticed about Rowan Ashcroft was that he didn't talk much. The second thing they noticed, usually about 30 seconds later, was that when he did talk, he meant every word. He was 32 years old in the autumn of 1878, which made him older than most of the unmarried men in Harlan County, Kansas, and younger than the land itself seemed to demand. The frontier had a way of aging people, not just in the lines around their eyes or the roughness of their hands, but in something deeper, something behind the eyes that went quiet and careful after enough winters had passed. Men who'd come out here at 20 sometimes looked 50 by the time they hit 30. Women who'd come as brides looked like they'd lived 3 lives before they were 40. Rowan didn't look that way. People found that suspicious. He stood 6 feet even, with dark brown hair that needed cutting about 3 weeks before he ever got around to cutting it, and hands that were scarred from fence wire and cold iron, and one particularly bad argument with a horse back in '74. He wasn't handsome in any way that would make a woman stop walking, but he wasn't the kind of man you forgot either. There was a stillness to him. Not the stillness of a man who had nothing to say, but the stillness of a man who'd learned that most conversations weren't worth interrupting. He'd come to Harlan County in 1873 with his father's old horse, $200, and a land claim that turned out to be better than advertised, which almost never happened, so he'd spent the first 6 months waiting for the other boot to drop. It never did. The soil was dark and honest in a way that Kansas soil sometimes was, stubborn but productive, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his 400 acres didn't dry up in summer the way the county agent had nervously hinted it might. By 1878, he had a working ranch, not a grand operation. 30 head of cattle, a kitchen garden, a barn that didn't lean anymore since he'd rebuilt the north wall in the spring, and a root cellar that could hold enough provisions to last a hard winter. He'd done most of the building himself, with occasional help from his nearest neighbor, a Finnish farmer named Aino Makinen, who lived 3 miles east and communicated mostly through the quality of his handshake. The house was the thing people couldn't stop talking about. Most frontier homes were built to survive. You put up 4 walls, a roof, a door that latched against the wind, and a fireplace that drew without filling the room with smoke, and you called it a home and thanked whatever luck had let you finish it before November. The houses Rowan's neighbors had built looked like what they were, structures assembled by exhausted people against a deadline set by the weather. Rowan's house looked like someone had thought about it. It wasn't large. 3 rooms downstairs, 2 up, with proper windows on the southern face to catch whatever winter sun the clouds permitted. The walls were frame construction, not sod. He'd hauled the lumber from the railhead himself over 2 summers, which had cost him money he didn't have and time he couldn't spare, and he'd done it anyway. The kitchen had a proper iron stove that vented correctly and a sink with a hand pump connected to a cistern he'd dug and lined himself. The floors were planed smooth. The staircase had a banister. And the porch. The porch was what started the talking. He'd built it facing west, which was sensible. Western sunsets on the Kansas prairie were the kind of thing that made even exhausted people stop moving for a few minutes. Wide plank boards, a roof supported by 4 square posts, with enough depth that you could sit under it in a rainstorm and stay mostly dry. He'd built a railing along the front, and at the end of one afternoon in September, he'd carried 2 rocking chairs out and set them side by side, about 3 feet apart, angled slightly toward each other the way chairs are when 2 people want to be able to talk without turning their whole body. 2 chairs. His nearest neighbor on the western side was a woman named Hattie Brennan, who was 53 years old, had buried one husband and divorced another, and made the best apple butter in Harlan County, despite claiming she'd never liked apple butter. She'd been riding past on her way back from the general store when she saw Rowan setting out the second chair, and she'd pulled her horse up and stared. "Rowan," she'd called across the fence. "Who's that second chair for?" He'd straightened up, looked at it, then looked at her. Someone I haven't met yet. She'd stared at him for a moment with the particular expression of a woman trying to determine whether a man was being deep or simply strange. Then she'd clicked her tongue at her horse and ridden on. By the following Sunday, everyone within 12 miles knew about the chair. The reactions varied. Hattie Brennan thought it was either very romantic or a sign of something wrong in the upper story, and she couldn't decide which. Eno Makinen, when told the story, had nodded slowly and said, which was actually high praise from Ino. The brothers who ran the feed store in town, two large men named Gerald and Pete Dowd, who had opinions about everything and made sure everyone knew it, laughed until Gerald nearly choked on his coffee. "Man's building furniture for a ghost," Gerald told anyone who'd listen. "Out here 5 years and the loneliness has finally cracked him." "2 chairs," Pete would add, shaking his head in theatrical wonder, like he ordered one from a catalog and got an extra. Rowan heard most of this. Harlan County was not a large place, and sound traveled in ways that conversation didn't. He heard it, and he didn't change anything about the porch. And he didn't try to explain himself to anyone except Hattie Brennan, who cornered him at the general store one October afternoon and asked him directly what he was doing. "I'm placing an advertisement," he told her. She blinked. "What kind of advertisement?" "For a wife." She was quiet for a moment, then, "There are women in this county, Rowan." "I know." He picked up the tin of coffee he'd been looking for, checked the price, set it down. "I've met most of them." "And?" He thought about how to say it. "I'm not looking for someone to work the house. I can work the house. I'm not looking for someone to be lonely with. I can be lonely by myself and save her the trouble." He looked at Hattie, who was watching him with an expression that had gone from skeptical to something more careful. "I want someone I can talk to, someone who has ideas about things, someone who got somewhere she was going, even though it was hard to get there." Hattie was quiet for a longer moment. Then she said, "That's a lot to ask for from a newspaper advertisement." "I know." "You might not find her." "I know that too." She watched him pick up the coffee tin again and bring it to the counter. Then she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "What does the advertisement say?" Tut. He'd written it 6 times before he'd arrived at something he could live with. The first version was too formal. It read like a legal document, all specifications and requirements, the kind of thing that described a position rather than a life. He'd burned that one. The second was too eager, the kind of earnest desperation that would attract either pity or contempt. He'd burned that one too. The third was too short. The fourth was too long. The fifth was something in between that still felt wrong in a way he couldn't name, like a sentence that was grammatically correct but meant something slightly different than what it was trying to say. The 6th version he wrote slowly, over 2 evenings, by lamplight, and when he read it back he decided it would have to do because he'd run out of paper. It read, in part, "Rancher 32, established on good land in Harlan County, Kansas, seeks a partner in the real sense of the word. Not a housekeeper, not a hostess, not someone to fill the quiet hours or manage what I cannot manage alone. I have a working house with a warm kitchen, a porch that faces west, and no illusions about what frontier life costs a person. If you have been somewhere and done something and are looking for a life that is genuinely your own rather than simply attached to someone else's, I would like to hear from you. I am not a poet. I am not particularly interesting at parties, if there were parties out here, which there largely aren't. But I will listen to whatever you have to say, and I will mean what I tell you, and I will not ask you to be smaller than you are. Write to R. Ashcroft, Harlan County, Kansas." He sent it to 3 papers, the Kansas City Star, the Chicago Tribune, and on an impulse he couldn't fully explain, a small Philadelphia paper called the Evening Ledger, whose subscription copies occasionally made their way out to the frontier 6 weeks after publication and were passed around until they fell apart. He waited. The first letters arrived in December. There were 14 of them in the first batch, which the postmaster in town, a nervous man named Stovall, handed over with the particular expression of someone who is trying not to have opinions about other people's business and failing. Rowan carried them home in his coat pocket, made coffee, and read them at the kitchen table. They were not what he'd hoped for. Most of them were perfectly fine letters from perfectly fine women who were looking for perfectly reasonable things: a stable situation, a man who didn't drink too much, a home that was better than what they currently had. There was nothing wrong with any of that. He read each one carefully because they'd taken the trouble to write, and he respected that. But reading them felt like reading a list of requirements from the other direction, a catalog of what they needed rather than who they were. One woman wrote primarily about her cooking. Another devoted 3 paragraphs to her skill with a needle and thread. A third, who identified herself only as Mrs. W., wrote in a hand so formal and careful that every sentence felt like it had been practiced beforehand, and asked whether he owned his land outright or had debts against it. He put them in a pile, thought about what to do with them, and eventually wrote polite responses to each one explaining that he wished them well and hoped they found what they were looking for. He meant it. He just knew it wasn't him they were looking for, and he didn't want to waste their time. More letters came in January, 11 more, then 8 in February. He read them all. And then in the last week of February, in a batch of 3 letters that arrived together, he found the one. He didn't know it immediately. He almost missed it, actually. The envelope was plain, the handwriting functional rather than decorative, and she hadn't bothered with the kind of careful opening pleasantries that most of the other letters had used to ease into their subject. She just started talking, as if she'd been in the middle of a conversation and was picking it up again. "Mr. Ashcroft, I want to be honest with you before I say anything else, because I've noticed that most people aren't, and it causes tremendous amounts of trouble. I am 28 years old, I have ink permanently under my fingernails from working a compositor's box, and I have opinions about most things that I've been told are inconvenient. I live in Philadelphia. I work in my father's print shop on Walnut Street, and I have been told by 3 separate people over the past 2 years that I am too much for most men, which I've decided to take as a description of my minimum requirements rather than a flaw to correct. I read your advertisement twice. The first time I read it, I thought, this man sounds either genuine or desperately lonely, and I haven't decided which. The second time I read it, I thought, well, even if he's desperately lonely, at least he's honest about what he wants, which is more than most people manage. You asked for someone who has been somewhere and done something. I don't know if I qualify since I've mostly been in this city my whole life, but I have set type for 4 different newspapers, including one that was shut down by City Hall for publishing something true that certain people didn't want published, and I have opinions about Reconstruction politics, the labor question, westward expansion, and the proper way to edit a sentence, some of which I will share with you if you write back, and some of which I'll keep to myself until I've decided whether you can be trusted with them. What does your porch face? E. Whitlock. P.S. I'm told Kansas winters are severe. I've never been cold in a way that frightened me, but I've also never been cold in Kansas, so I'm withholding judgment. Rowan read it twice. Then he got up, poured more coffee, came back and read it a 3rd time. Then he sat there for a while, looking at the February light coming through the kitchen window, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in... He tried to remember. He wasn't sure. A long time. He wrote back that same afternoon. Miss Whitlock, west. The porch faces west. I'll answer your question about loneliness directly. I am sometimes desperately lonely, yes. I expect most people who are honest would say the same, but most people aren't honest about it. I don't think loneliness disqualifies a person from anything. It usually just means they're paying attention to the absence of something they believe should be there. You say you have opinions about westward expansion. I would be interested in those when you decide I can be trusted with them. I should warn you that I've formed opinions about westward expansion myself from the inside, having done it, and we may not agree. I don't think that's a problem. I've never found disagreement as dangerous as people say it is when the people involved are actually listening to each other. The winters here are severe in ways that I've gotten used to, and that may seem different when you're in them. The cold here has a character to it. It isn't just a temperature, it's a presence. I don't mean that in a frightening way. I mean it the way you'd describe any place that has a strong personality. You said you'll keep some opinions to yourself until you've decided I can be trusted. I'll be honest with you. I don't know how to prove that in a letter. I think trust is built slowly, by showing up the same way repeatedly over time, and letters might not be the best environment for it, but it might be the only environment we have for now, so I'll try. I'm glad you wrote. R. Ashcroft. She wrote back in 12 days, which was fast for the distance, which meant she'd written quickly. Within a few days of receiving his letter, maybe sooner. He noticed that. Over the next 3 months, they wrote back and forth with a frequency that began to feel less like correspondence and more like conversation. She wrote about the print shop, the physical reality of it, the smell of ink and hot metal, the sound the press made when it was running right versus when something was binding in the mechanism. She wrote about her father, Daniel Whitlock, who had started the business 30 years ago and who was still the better typesetter despite hands that shook slightly on cold mornings. She wrote about Philadelphia, not as a postcard, but as a place she both loved and felt trapped inside, its familiar streets having acquired the particular oppressiveness of things you know too well. She wrote about what she wanted, which was unusual. Most of the letters he'd received had been careful around that subject, approaching it sideways, speaking of hopes and circumstances rather than desires. Eleanor Whitlock was not careful about it. "I want to own my own time," she wrote in March. "I don't mean I want to stop working. I think I'd lose my mind without work. I mean, I want the work to be mine, and the decisions to be mine. And when I'm wrong about something, I want it to be my own wrong decision rather than someone else's that I went along with." Is that available in Kansas? I'm genuinely asking. I've heard that frontier women have more legal standing in some ways, more actual say in how things are run. Is that what you've seen? He wrote back, "What I've seen is that frontier women have more work, which is not quite the same thing as more freedom, though sometimes it's the same thing in practice because nobody has time to try to stop you from doing something when there's enough to do." My neighbor Hattie Brennan, who is 53 and has opinions about everything including my porch, runs her operation without asking permission from anyone that I've ever seen. Whether that's freedom or just necessity, I couldn't tell you. Probably both. I won't pretend that what you want is available here in any clean, simple way. It isn't. But I'll tell you what I think. A person with the qualities you've described, someone who knows her own mind and isn't interested in being managed, tends to make the freedom she needs rather than waiting for someone to offer it. You sound like that kind of person. I think Kansas would find you useful, whether it liked you or not. She wrote back, "That may be the finest compliment I've ever received. I'm not sure whether to be pleased or concerned." By April, Rowan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, looking forward to things. The mail run was twice a week to town, and he'd always done it because he had to, for supplies, for news, for whatever business needed attending to. Now he found himself calculating days between letters, noting that her last one had said she was working on a particularly complicated job for a law firm and might be slow to write, and checking that calculation against the days since her last letter, and then feeling slightly foolish for checking it. Hattie Brennan noticed. "You've got a letter correspondent," she said, less as a question than as a statement of evidence she'd already assembled. "Yes." "From the advertisement." "Yes." Hattie was quiet for a moment, which with Hattie could mean anything. Then she said, "What's she like?" Rowan thought about it. "Honest," he said. "Direct. She works in a print shop. She has opinions about editing sentences." That sounds either wonderful or exhausting. "Probably both." Hattie laughed. A short, real laugh, not the performative kind. "You like her?" He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "Does she know about the chair?" "Not yet." "You should tell her," Hattie said. "Either she'll think it's sweet, or she'll think you've lost your mind, and either way she deserves to know what she's considering." 2. He told her about the chair in a letter he wrote on a Sunday evening in May, when the light was long and gold and the prairie had gone through one of its brief, spectacular spring green phases that made you almost forgive it for everything else. "I should tell you something about the porch," he wrote. "There are 2 rocking chairs on it. I built them, or bought them, technically, from a man in town who makes furniture, about 2 months before I placed the advertisement. Some of my neighbors found this amusing or concerning, depending on their disposition. I put them there because I believe the house should be built for what I hoped it would become, not just for what it currently was. The second chair has been empty for 2 years. I don't tell you this to pressure you toward anything. I tell you because you said you wanted to be honest with me before you said anything else. And it seems like I should offer you the same thing. The chair is there. It's waiting. But I want to be very clear that it's waiting for whoever you actually are, not for the idea of a woman to fill an empty space. There's a difference between those 2 things, and I think it matters. The porch still faces west. There was a longer pause than usual before her reply came. 10 days. He told himself the mail was slow. He mostly believed it. When her letter arrived, he opened it, standing at the kitchen counter, and read it there. Rowan, she'd written, the first time she'd used his given name. I've read your letter about the chair 4 times. The first time I felt alarmed. The second time I felt something I can't quite name. Not alarmed, but very awake, the way you feel when something real is happening. The third time I thought, this is either the most presumptuous thing a man has ever written to me, or it is somehow exactly right, and I cannot figure out which. The fourth time I just sat with it. Here is what I can tell you. I have been thinking about Kansas in a way I didn't expect. Not as an abstract possibility or an escape or any of the things I might have expected to think. I've been thinking about what it actually looks like in the morning, what the work feels like, what it sounds like at night when there's no city noise, what it would be like to sit on a west-facing porch. I am not saying yes to anything. I am saying that I am thinking about things in a way that seems significant. I wanted you to know that. Eleanor. He read it again. Then he folded it along its original creases and put it in the tin box on the shelf above the fireplace, where he kept the things that mattered. By June, they were writing differently, not about less serious things. If anything, the letters had gotten more serious, more specific, more honest in the particular way that honesty becomes when you're no longer testing the water and have just decided to get in. But the register had shifted. There was less formality, more shorthand, the small abbreviations that develop in any relationship where 2 people have been talking long enough to stop explaining themselves from the beginning every time. She'd started writing longer letters. They'd arrive in envelopes that were slightly thick, 2 or 3 pages instead of 1, the handwriting getting smaller and closer together toward the end, as if she'd run out of space and hadn't wanted to stop. He'd started doing the same. In one letter, she described a night at the print shop, when the press had jammed at 2 a.m. during a run that had to be finished by dawn for a morning edition. And she'd spent 4 hours with a lamp and a wrench and her father sleeping in the chair in the corner because he'd refused to go home until it was done. There is a particular quality to working on something broken in the middle of the night when everything depends on fixing it. The rest of the world goes very quiet. The problem in front of you becomes the whole world. I've never felt more competent and more frightened at the same time. By the time I had it running again, my hands were shaking, and I had grease on my face, and my father woke up and said, "Did you fix it?" And I said yes, and he said good, and went back to sleep. That was the nicest thing he could have said. I didn't want to be told I'd done well. I just wanted confirmation that it was done. He read that letter on the porch in the early evening. He thought about it for a while. Then he wrote back, "I know that feeling. Not the printing press specifically, but the thing itself. The problem that is the whole world for as long as you're in it. I had a stretch of fence down in the north pasture last winter during the January cold, the worst cold, the kind that makes your face hurt if you breathe wrong. The cattle would have been in trouble. I spent 6 hours in weather I had no business being in, fixing a fence post by post, and when I got the last one in, I stood there in the dark and the cold for a while before I could make myself walk back to the house. Not from exhaustion, just because the thing was done. And I needed a moment to let that be true. Your father sounds like a good man. Tell me more about him, if you want to." She told him more about her father. He told her more about the land. They told each other things that were harder to say. Her frustration at the way the city felt smaller every year, despite being larger. His occasional fear, never admitted to anyone before, that he'd built something worth having but had no one to have it with. "I don't mean the ranch," he clarified in one letter. "Or not only the ranch, I mean the days, the evenings, the whole accumulation of days and evenings that becomes a life. I have a life that is functional and sometimes good and occasionally beautiful. The light here can be beautiful in a way that's hard to describe because it sounds like the kind of thing people say about places. But I've been in it alone, and I'm aware of that in the way you're aware of any absence." She wrote back, "I know what you mean. Though my version of it is different, I'm in a city of 1 million people and I'm aware of the absence all the time. I'm not sure which is lonelier. I think probably the one you're in right now, but only by a little." In August, she told him she was coming. Not immediately. She needed time to arrange things, to find someone reliable to help her father in the shop, to save enough money for the train fare without letting her father know she was saving it, because he'd insist on paying for it himself and he couldn't afford to. But she was coming. She'd decided. The letter was short. She didn't explain at length, didn't dress it up. She just said, "I've decided." I'm coming in the late fall if you'll still have me. I wanted you to know that I've thought about it as carefully as I know how, and I'm not coming because I have no other options or because I'm running from something, though that's what people here assume when a woman goes west. I'm coming because I want to, because I've read everything you've written to me and I believe it, and that doesn't happen very often. I'll need to make arrangements. Give me until October, maybe November. Eleanor. He read the letter on the porch, in the second chair. He sat there for a long time after he'd finished reading it, watching the sun go down over the grass, and didn't try to name what he was feeling because he wasn't sure he had the right word for it. Not happiness exactly, though that was in there. Something more like the feeling he'd had when he'd sunk the last fence post in the January cold, and known it was done. Something finished. Something begun. Bad. September passed. October came in cold and serious, the way it did out here. The sky going a particular shade of steel gray that meant winter wasn't suggesting anymore. It was making plans. He put up the last of the hay in the first week, replaced the weather stripping on the back door, checked the stovepipe in the upstairs room that he designated as hers. He hadn't told her about that, wasn't sure how to, had just quietly made the decision that the south-facing room with the better window would be hers when she arrived, if she arrived. He made himself add the if when he thought about it, because he'd learned enough about life to know that things that were supposed to happen didn't always happen, and preparing yourself for only one outcome was a kind of borrowing against a future that didn't belong to you yet. In late October, her letter arrived with news he hadn't expected. Rowan, I have to tell you something, and I don't know how to tell it without it sounding worse than it is. So I'm going to tell it plainly and then explain. My father is ill, not immediately dying, was. I want to be clear about that because if I don't say it first, you'll assume the worst. But the doctor has said his heart is tired, which is a gentle way of saying it is working harder than it should and may not be working well for very much longer. He's 59 years old and has been setting type since he was 14, and his body has opinions about that. He is not in immediate danger, but he is not well, and I am the only one who knows the shop well enough to run it if he cannot. I'm telling you this because I may not be able to come in November. I may not be able to come until I can find someone to take my place. I am working on finding someone. I am trying very hard to work on finding someone while also managing everything else. I don't want you to think I've changed my mind, because I haven't. I want to tell you that clearly, before anything else. I haven't changed my mind. I just don't know how long. Eleanor. He read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, with the wind outside working at the shutters the way it did in October, testing things, checking what was loose. He sat with it for a while. Then he went to his desk and wrote back. Eleanor, the chair isn't going anywhere. Take whatever time you need. Your father matters. The shop matters. Do what you have to do and don't spend any part of your effort worrying about what I think. Because what I think is, you're doing the right thing, and it doesn't change anything from my end. I've waited this long. I know how to wait. Rowan. He sealed it and set it on the counter to go to the post the next morning. Then he put on his coat and went out to the porch and sat in his chair. Just his chair, not hers. He was careful about that, and watched the dark prairie for a while. The second chair sat beside him in the October cold, empty and patient. He thought, this is what I built it for. Not for a guarantee, for a possibility that was worth holding open. The wind came across the grass flat and hard and cold, and he pulled his coat tighter and stayed where he was, and the night was long and quiet and dark, and the chair beside him was empty but not abandoned. There was a difference. He was sure of that. To be continued in Part 2. The weight of what she carried, where Eleanor fights to save what her father built, while everything she's building toward waits in the cold. Int. Drop your city below. Let's see how far Rowan and Eleanor's story has traveled. The winter that came to Philadelphia in November of 1878 arrived without any of the romance that people who'd never lived through a city winter tended to assign to it. There was no clean blanket of snow over quiet streets. There was slush and coal smoke, and the particular gray-brown color that the sky turned when 1,000 chimneys were all burning at once and the wind wasn't cooperating. The cobblestones on Walnut Street were treacherous by 7 in the morning and worse by evening, and Eleanor Whitlock had fallen twice already, once on the steps of the shop and once on the corner of 4th. And both times she'd gotten up without stopping because there wasn't time to stop. There wasn't time for most things. That November, her father's name was Daniel, and he was the kind of man who believed that admitting physical difficulty was a form of complaint, and complaint was a form of weakness, and weakness was something you kept private. So he came to the shop every morning at 6:30, the same as always, and he set type with hands that Eleanor watched carefully and said nothing about. And he ran the press on jobs that Eleanor had already preset the night before, so the physical demand was lighter. And he didn't say thank you for any of it because thanking her would have meant acknowledging that she'd done it on purpose. It was an arrangement built entirely on the pretense that everything was fine, maintained by two people who both knew it wasn't, and it held because neither of them wanted to be the one to say so first. The Hendricks account needs the corrections by Friday, her father said one morning, not looking up from the type tray he was organizing with methodical slowness. I already sent them a proof, Eleanor said. She was at the other press, cleaning the rollers, a job she'd done so many times her hands moved without instruction. They approved it Tuesday. A pause. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. I handled it. Another pause, longer. Eleanor. Papa. I am not so ill that I need to be. I'm not managing you, she said, still not looking up. I'm managing the shop. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is there? She set down the roller cloth and looked at him then. He was standing at the type tray with his hands still, and she could see, in the particular stillness of his hands, which had never been still in all the years she'd watched him work, that he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the morning. Yes, she said more quietly. There is. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then he nodded, once, and went back to the type, and neither of them said anything else about it. That was the version of the conversation they had every 3 or 4 days, in different words, with the same shape. What they didn't talk about was the letter on the shelf above the compositing desk. Rowan's last letter, the one that said the chair isn't going anywhere, the one Eleanor had read so many times the paper had softened at the fold lines. She hadn't hidden it exactly, but she hadn't left it somewhere her father would see it either. He didn't know about the correspondence. She'd made a decision, early on, not to tell him until there was something definite to tell, partly because she knew he'd worry, and partly because she'd needed the letters to belong only to her for a while. Something that was entirely hers, not subject to anyone's opinion or concern. She was beginning to wonder if that had been a mistake. The arrangement that would free her, the one she needed, the person who could learn the shop well enough to take her place, was not coming together easily. She'd asked around. There were typesetters in the city, men mostly, some women, a few of whom were genuinely skilled. The problem was not finding someone who could set type. The problem was finding someone her father would accept as a replacement, who was reliable enough to actually be trusted with the business, who would work for what the business could pay, which was not impressive, and who didn't have some other situation that would take them away after 3 months. The first person she'd approached was a man named Callum, who was 24 and fast at the compositing box and had a good eye for layout. He'd said yes, then changed his mind when a position opened at the larger press 2 streets over that paid 30% more. She didn't blame him. She was frustrated with him anyway. The second was a woman named Ruth, who was 30 and serious and knew the trade well, and had seemed genuinely interested until Eleanor made the mistake of mentioning her father's health in too much detail, and Ruth, who had her own sick parents, apparently, and had learned from that experience, quietly withdrew. By December, Eleanor was writing to Rowan with the careful precision of someone trying not to sound as tired as she was. The situation here is complicated, she wrote. I want to give you an honest account and not the managed version. So here it is. I have not yet found the right person. I am working on it. My father is stable, which is good, and the shop is running, which is also good, and I am the reason both of those things are true, which is less good in the sense that I can feel myself being held here, not by love alone, but by necessity, which is a different thing, and one I'm aware of in ways that make me angry sometimes and sad sometimes, and mostly just very tired. I'm not telling you this to complain. I'm telling you because you told me once that you didn't want the managed version, and I'm trying to keep that promise even when what I have to report is less than I'd hoped. Is the second chair still there? He wrote back within a week, which was fast for December with the mail unreliable in winter conditions. It is. I moved it inside for the worst of the weather. I didn't want the wood to crack, but it's in the front room, and I'll put it back when the worst passes. This is not a metaphor. I just didn't want the chair to crack. You said you're angry sometimes. Good. Angry means you know what you want. The people who stop being angry are the ones who've stopped wanting things, and those are the ones you have to worry about. Don't stop being angry, Eleanor. It means you're still in this. She read that letter sitting on the edge of her narrow bed in the room above the shop at 11 o'clock at night, with the sounds of the city outside her window doing what city sounds do, the ceaseless background noise that you stopped hearing until you tried to imagine not hearing it. She thought about silence, not the silence of a room where someone had just left, but the kind of silence that had its own texture, its own character. The silence Rowan had described when he wrote about the prairie at night. She was so tired that her eyes ached. Her right hand had a cramp from a full day at the compositing box that had started before she could get it to release, so her hand just ached steadily in a way she'd learned to ignore. She should sleep. She read the letter one more time, and then she did. The person who finally changed things was not someone she'd gone looking for. He showed up at the shop door on a Wednesday afternoon in January, carrying a leather bag of typesetting tools and wearing a coat that had been mended so many times in so many different places that it was hard to tell what the original coat had looked like. His name was Thomas Garrett, and he was 19 years old, and he'd learned the trade in Baltimore before the shop he worked at had closed. And he'd come to Philadelphia because his sister lived here, and he needed somewhere to land while he found work. "Who sent you?" Eleanor asked. She was behind the counter, and she looked at him the way she'd learned to look at everyone who came asking for work, trying to see past whatever presentation they'd put together and find the actual person underneath. "Nobody," Thomas said. "I asked at 3 shops on this street. 2 told me they weren't hiring. The woman at the stationery place next door said you might be." "Mrs. Carver sent you? She said to tell you she thinks you're running yourself into the ground and you need help." Eleanor stared at him for a moment. Then she almost laughed. Not the amused kind, the kind that was mostly exhaustion finally surfacing. "Come in," she said. She gave him a test, the way she always did, set him up at the compositing box with a marked-up page of text, and watched from the doorway while she pretended to do something else. He was good. Not as fast as she was, but more careful, methodical in a way that meant fewer corrections. His spacing was clean. He didn't rush the end of lines the way younger typesetters often did. Her father came out from the back at some point and stood watching without announcing himself, which was his habit. "The boy's decent," her father said, after Thomas had left with instructions to come back Friday. "His name is Thomas." "I know his name. I heard the introduction." Her father looked at the type tray Thomas had used, running one finger along the set text the way he'd checked her work when she was 12 years old. "He's got a good eye." "Yes." "You're thinking of training him." "I'm thinking of more than that." She waited. Her father's fingers stopped on the type. She said, "Papa, I need to tell you something I should have told you months ago." She told him about Rowan, about the advertisement, the letters, the correspondence that had been going on for almost a year. She told him about Kansas, about the house, about the west-facing porch. She didn't perform any of it. She was too tired to perform anything. She just laid it out in the same plain way she'd learned from Rowan's letters, the way of speaking that didn't dress things up to protect the listener from the actual shape of the news. Her father listened without interrupting, which was not like him. He stood with his hands at his sides, and she watched his face go through several things she couldn't entirely read. When she finished, there was a long silence. "How long?" he said finally. "Since last February." He absorbed that. "And you didn't tell me." "No." "Because you knew I'd—" He stopped. "What did you think I'd do?" "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I still don't, entirely. That's why I'm telling you now instead of just leaving." That landed. She saw it land. His jaw tightened for a moment, and she felt a sharp pang of something. Guilt, maybe, or the complicated love that lived right next to guilt when the person in question was someone you loved and had also, at various times, wanted to escape. "He's a rancher," her father said. "Yes." "In Kansas?" "Yes." "And you've never met him?" "No." "But I know him, Papa. I know it sounds like something a foolish person would say, but I've been writing to this man for almost a year, and I know his mind and how it works. and I believe him." Her father looked at her for a long time. There were things happening in his face that she couldn't decode, and she'd known his face her whole life, so that told her how complicated those things were. "Does he know about—" He gestured slightly at his own chest, meaning his heart, meaning the whole situation. "Yes, I told him in October." "What did he say?" She almost smiled. "He said the chair wasn't going anywhere." Her father made a sound that was hard to categorize. Not quite a laugh. Not quite the other thing either. He turned back to the type tray, and she thought the conversation was over, and then he said, without turning around, "This Thomas Garrett, if he's as capable as he looks, and you train him properly—" "It would take until spring," she said. "Maybe April." "Spring." He was quiet. "Eleanor." "Papa, I want you to be—" He stopped. Started again. "I've never been good at saying these things." "I know." If he's a decent man, he still wasn't looking at her. If he's what his letters make him sound like, that would— He cleared his throat. That would be something. It was not a blessing, exactly, but from Daniel Whitlock, whose vocabulary of emotional approval was limited and had always been, it was as close to one as she was likely to get. She felt the back of her eyes go warm and blinked it away, because if she started crying in the middle of the shop floor, they'd both be embarrassed. "I'll train Thomas properly," she said. "I'll document everything. He'll know the clients, the accounts, the suppliers. You won't be left without—" "I know you'll do it right," her father said, with a finality that meant he believed her. "You always do things right." She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the shop, with the smell of ink around her and the sound of the street outside, feeling the particular weight of a decision that had been made. Not today, not in this conversation, but over months of letters and sleepless nights and hands cramped from typesetting, a weight that was lifting now in a way that made her simultaneously lighter and more afraid. Training. Thomas took the better part of 3 months. She was rigorous about it, not because she was a perfectionist by nature, though she was, but because she understood that her leaving would only be something she could live with if she left the shop in a state that was genuinely functional and not just optimistically so. She documented the client accounts in a ledger she'd bought with her own money. She walked Thomas through every piece of equipment until he could diagnose problems without her. She introduced him to the suppliers, to the regular clients, to the particular quirks of each piece of machinery, the press that needed an extra pass of oil on the left roller before a long run, the type drawer that stuck in humid weather, the billing system her father had invented 40 years ago that made perfect sense if you understood it and none at all if you didn't. Thomas was a good student, not always a fast one. There were things he had to be told twice and once 3 times, but he was serious, and he asked good questions, and he didn't pretend to understand things he didn't understand, which was rarer than it should have been and made him much easier to teach. In March, she wrote to Rowan, "I think April. I think it might actually be April." He wrote back, "The chair is back on the porch. I checked the wood. It's fine." She laughed out loud, alone at her desk, in a way that startled her because she hadn't laughed like that in months. Unguarded, involuntary, the kind that happened before you could decide whether it was appropriate. April came. The last week of training, she stood behind Thomas while he ran a full print job from start to finish without assistance, and she didn't say anything, and he made 2 small errors and caught and corrected both of them himself. And when it was done, she said, "That's it. That's what you need to know." He looked at the finished stack of pages. "Did I do all right?" "You did fine," she said. And then, because it was true, and she wanted him to know it was true, "My father's shop is in good hands." Thomas nodded, taking the responsibility of that statement seriously, which was the right way to receive it. She bought her train ticket on the 15th of April. She wrote to Rowan with the date and the train number and the expected arrival in the nearest town with a station, which was a place called Millhaven, 14 miles from his land. She told him she'd be carrying a brown traveling case and a second bag with the books she couldn't leave behind, which was more books than was probably practical, and she knew it. He wrote back with the arrival information noted, and one additional line. "I'll be the one with the wagon and the bad haircut. I never remember to get it cut on time." She folded that letter and put it in her coat pocket, where it stayed for the remainder of April. Transferred from coat to coat, checked occasionally like a person checks a compass, there and real, and pointing in a specific direction. The morning she left, her father came downstairs earlier than usual. He was already dressed, which meant he hadn't slept well, which meant he wouldn't say that and she wouldn't ask. He made coffee, which they drank standing up at the kitchen counter because neither of them wanted to sit down and make the leaving into a scene. "The Hendricks account renews in May," she said. "Thomas knows." "I know Thomas knows. You've told him 4 times. 5. The corner of her father's mouth moved. "You'll write." "Often. Not so often that it becomes a burden." "It won't be a burden," she said. He set down his cup and looked at her. Really looked at her in the way that parents occasionally do when they're trying to fix something in their memory, and she had the sudden understanding that he was doing exactly that, and she had to look at the window for a moment. "Eleanor." His voice was careful in the way it got when he was managing something he didn't want to mismanage. "I want you to know that your mother would have—" He stopped. "She would have been glad," he said finally, "to see you go find something. She'd have said so herself and used better words." Eleanor set her own cup down. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her father, who was not a man who hugged easily and who stiffened slightly before his arms came up and held her anyway, briefly and fiercely. "All right," she said into his shoulder. "Go," he said, "before one of us embarrasses themselves." She picked up her bags. She walked out of the shop and onto Walnut Street, where the April morning was cold and damp and smelled of the city she had lived in her entire life. She walked 3 blocks to the station without looking back. Not because she didn't love what she was leaving. She did. She loved it with the complicated love of things that have shaped you without quite fitting you. But because looking back felt like a question she'd already answered. The train west left Philadelphia at 8:15 in the morning, in a gust of steam and noise that should have felt dramatic and mostly just felt loud. Eleanor found her seat, arranged her bags, and looked out the window as the city began to slide past. Rooftops, then the edge of things, then the open spaces that grew longer and wider as the hours passed. Somewhere in the brown bag, tucked between a copy of a novel she'd been meaning to finish and a change of clothes, was a letter she hadn't sent yet. She'd written it last night and hadn't been able to decide, and in the end she'd packed it instead of burning it, telling herself she'd decide on the train. It was a letter she'd started a dozen times over the past 3 months, and abandoned a dozen times, about something she hadn't been able to bring herself to put in any of the letters she'd actually sent. Not a lie exactly, an omission. A thing she'd told herself she'd say in person, because some things were too significant to commit to paper, and then kept finding reasons to delay. And now the train was moving, and in 2 days she'd be in Millhaven, Kansas, 14 miles from a house she'd never seen and a man she'd never met in the flesh. And the omission was still sitting there like a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it. She didn't open the letter, she just knew it was there. Outside the window, the city fell away, and the land opened up wide and flat and entirely indifferent to whatever she was carrying, and the train moved west, and Eleanor Whitlock watched it go and tried to decide what to do with the truth she hadn't found the courage to say yet. The train took 2 days and 1 night to reach Millhaven, with a transfer in Kansas City that Eleanor nearly missed because the platform signs were wrong, and a porter pointed her in the opposite direction from where she needed to go. She ran the last 40 yards with her brown case banging against her knee and her book bag swinging badly, and she made it onto the car as the whistle blew, and she sat down in the nearest empty seat and spent 5 minutes just breathing. The woman across the aisle from her, a large, practical-looking woman with a baby on her lap and a toddler asleep against her side, watched this with the mild interest of someone who had seen worse. "Missed connections?" the woman asked. "Nearly," Eleanor said. "You going far?" "Millhaven?" The woman nodded. "End of the line. My sister's outside of Millhaven. It's quiet out there." She said it without judgment, which made it feel like an honest report rather than a warning. Eleanor looked out the window at the Kansas landscape moving past and thought about quiet in a way she couldn't have 2 years ago, when quiet had meant the shop was closed and something was wrong. The land out here was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't absence. It was presence of a different sort. Grass and sky and the occasional farmstead set far back from the tracks. The buildings small against the space around them in a way that wasn't diminishing exactly, but was honest. Nothing out here pretended to be larger than it was. She had the letter in her coat pocket. She'd moved it from the bag to her pocket somewhere around the Missouri border without entirely deciding to, and now it sat against her ribs like a coal that hadn't quite gone cold. She didn't open it. She watched Kansas come. Millhaven was smaller than she'd expected, which was saying something because she hadn't expected much. One main street with a general store, a post office that shared a building with a barber shop, a grain elevator that was the tallest structure in town, and looked it. A handful of houses on the cross streets with the particular look of frontier houses, functional, spare, built to solve a problem rather than to create an impression. The station, if you could call it that, was a wooden platform beside the tracks with a small waiting shelter and a hand-painted sign that said Mill Haven in letters that had weathered unevenly, so the M was darker than everything else. Eleanor stepped down from the train into April wind that was colder and sharper than Philadelphia's April wind, a wind with some winter still in it, and stood on the platform with her bags and looked around. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing at the edge of the platform near a wagon, a solidly built man with dark hair that was indeed too long, just as he'd warned her, curling slightly at the collar of a coat that had seen several winters. He was scanning the passengers coming off the train with the careful attention of someone who had been waiting and was now in the specific state of needing what they'd been waiting for to actually appear. She had a strange moment of just watching him before he found her. He looked exactly like his letters and nothing like what she'd imagined, which was probably the truest thing she'd thought all year. The letters had given her his mind, his way of reasoning, the particular cadence of how he said things. But the physical fact of him was its own information, and she stood there with her bags and took it in. Then he saw her. She knew he'd recognized her not because he smiled. He did, eventually, but because something in his posture changed first, a kind of settling, like a man who had been holding a question for a very long time and had just received the answer. He walked across the platform toward her, and she walked toward him, and they met somewhere in the middle, which seemed right. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Ashcroft." She looked at his hair. "You weren't wrong about the haircut." Something in his face relaxed into something that was almost a smile but was quieter than that, more interior. "No," he said, "I wasn't." He looked at her for a moment with the directness she'd expected from his letters and hadn't quite believed would translate into person, and it did. "You're real," he said, and it sounded less like a statement than something he was confirming for himself. "I am," she said. "So are you." He took her bags without asking, which she might have objected to in other circumstances, but didn't, partly because her arms were tired and partly because it was done matter-of-factly as a practical thing rather than a statement about anything. He led her to the wagon, which had a horse she couldn't name the breed of but who looked reliable rather than impressive, and helped her up to the seat, and they set off along the road west out of Mill Haven with April clouds moving fast overhead and the grass on both sides of the road doing what Kansas grass did in April, moving in long, slow waves that made you realize how much wind there actually was when you saw what it was doing to something. They didn't talk for a while. This should have been awkward and wasn't, which Eleanor filed away as a thing to think about later. After a mile or so, Rowan said, "How was the trip?" "Long," she said. "I almost missed the connection in Kansas City." "That happens. The signs are wrong on Platform 3 and have been for 2 years. Nobody's fixed them." "Somebody should." "Yes," he said. "They should." He watched the road. "Your father. He was all right when you left?" "Tired, but all right." She paused. He said my mother would have been glad to see me go find something." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a good man." "He is," she said. "He's also complicated and difficult and not good at saying things. But he's a good man." "Most good men are complicated," Rowan said. "I think it comes with it." The house came into view from about a quarter-mile out, which was the thing about the prairie. You could see where you were going long before you got there. She'd been looking at it for a while before she fully understood what she was looking at. Frame construction, solid, with a proper roofline and windows that caught the afternoon light. A barn behind it, a kitchen garden to the side that was just beginning to show the early green of things coming up. And the porch, facing west, exactly as he'd said. 2 chairs. She didn't say anything about the chairs, neither did he. But she saw them, and he knew she'd seen them, and that was enough. He pulled the wagon up near the barn and helped her down, and she stood in the yard for a moment looking at the house. The wind moved through the grass around the edges of the yard, and somewhere near the barn, one of the cattle made a sound, and the whole place had the particular smell of working land, soil and hay and animal, and something underneath all of it that was just the smell of ground that had been broken open and planted in and lived on. "It's real," she said, almost to herself. "Did you think it wouldn't be?" She looked at him. "I thought it might be. I don't know. Smaller than the letters made it sound." He considered that. "Is it?" She looked back at the house, at the porch, the two chairs, the windows catching light. "No," she said. "It's about what the letters said." He showed her through the house in the practical way of a man who lives alone and is aware that his domestic arrangements may not meet someone else's standards, pointing out where things were rather than apologizing for them, which she appreciated. The kitchen was warm from the stove and larger than she'd expected. The front room had bookshelves, not decorative ones, actual shelves full of actual books with worn spines, which told her something useful about him. The upstairs room he showed her last, opening the door with a slight hesitation that was the closest thing to self-consciousness she'd seen from him yet. It was the south-facing room, the one with the better window. She stood in the doorway looking at the light the window threw across the floor. He hadn't said anything about which room he'd set aside for her, had never mentioned it in any letter, but it was clearly prepared, clean, with a quilt on the bed that looked recently acquired, a small table and chair near the window, a hook on the wall for her coat. "You did this on purpose," she said. "The south window gets more light," he said. "I thought, for reading, and if you wanted to write." She looked at the window, at the light, at the careful plainness of the room that had nonetheless been thought about. She felt something move through her that she was going to have to sit with privately later, when she wasn't standing in a doorway next to a man she'd only just met in the flesh. "Thank you," she said. "It's a practical decision," he said, in the way of a man who is not comfortable receiving thanks for things he considers obvious. "It's still a thank you," she said. He accepted that with a small nod and showed her where the water pitcher was. They ate supper that first evening at the kitchen table, which was where everything real seemed to happen in this house. She understood that within the first hour, the way you understand the geography of a house quickly when you pay attention. He'd made a stew that was straightforward and good, and had clearly been started earlier in the day in preparation for her arrival, though he didn't mention that. She didn't mention that she'd noticed. They talked more easily than she'd expected, with the particular fluency of people who've already done the hard work of getting to know each other and are now just confirming that the in-person version matches. Mostly it did. She noticed things. He was quieter than his letters. The letters were the eloquent version of him, the one that had more time to find the right word. In person, he said less and meant the same amount, which took a small adjustment. He noticed things too. She could tell by the way his attention moved, careful and specific. Not the performing attention of a man trying to impress, but the real thing, the noticing you did when something mattered to you. After supper, he asked if she wanted to sit on the porch. "It's April," she said. "In Kansas." "I know," he said. "I have an extra coat." They sat on the porch in the last light of the evening, with the cold coming in from the north and the sky going the colors it went out here. Colors she didn't have the right names for yet because she'd never needed them in Philadelphia, where the buildings interrupted the sky before it could do this. It was vast and layered and slightly alarming in its scale, the way real things were sometimes alarming when you'd only ever read about them. "You're thinking something," Rowan said. "How do you know?" "You got very still. In the letters, you got very precise when you were thinking something you weren't sure how to say. I assume in person you get still." She considered this. "That's accurate," she admitted. She looked at the horizon for a moment longer. "I have to tell you something." She felt him go attentive beside her, not tense, just present in a different way. "All right," he said. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the letter, the one she'd carried from Philadelphia, the one she'd written and not sent. She didn't hand it to him. She just held it. "I wrote this last night before I left," she said. "I should have sent it, or I should have said it in an earlier letter. I kept telling myself I'd say it in person, and then I kept finding reasons to wait, which means I've been waiting for months to say something that I should have said months ago." She stopped. I'm not going to read you the letter. I'm just going to say it. Okay, he said. She looked at the horizon rather than at him. When I told you my father was ill back in October, all of it. She paused. What I didn't tell you was that there was a second letter that came around the same time, from my father's business partner, a man my father hasn't spoken to in 6 years after a disagreement about money that was never fully resolved. She turned the unsent letter over in her hands. He's offering to buy the shop. A real offer, not a low one. If my father sells, he'd have enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Thomas wouldn't need a position to fill. The whole question of leaving would be simpler. She stopped again. Rowan waited. My father hasn't decided, she said. He was going to write to me once I was settled with his decision, which means there may be a letter coming. And if he decides to sell, that changes things. For him. Not for me. She finally looked at Rowan. I wanted you to know that was coming, that I've been carrying it since October, that I should have told you. Rowan was looking at her steadily. In the low evening light, she couldn't read his expression as well as she wanted to. Why didn't you? He said. Not accusatory, just asking. She thought about it honestly. Because I was afraid that if I told you there was a possibility the whole situation would resolve itself, you'd think I'd been manufacturing a reason to delay, and I wasn't. I was genuinely trying to leave the shop in good shape, but the offer exists and I've known it exists, and not telling you felt... She stopped. It felt like a small dishonesty, and I don't want to start anything with small dishonesty. The word anything sat between them for a moment, with everything it implied and hadn't named yet. Rowan looked out at the horizon. She watched his profile in the fading light, the line of his jaw, the stillness she'd identified in the first hour as the real version of his letter voice, the version that meant the same thing with fewer words. Eleanor, he said. Yes. You got on a train and came to Kansas. Yes. That's not a small thing. No, she said. It isn't. So I'm not particularly worried about a letter you chose to tell me about yourself. He paused. I might have liked to know sooner, but I understand why you didn't say it, and it doesn't change. He stopped, and she realized he'd run up against the same word she had, the word anything with its weight of implication. He started again. It doesn't change where we are. She let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than the last 10 minutes, possibly longer than the last 3 months. There's something else, she said. He looked at her. The letter, the one I'm holding. She looked down at it. There's something in here I couldn't say even just now about why I came, what I'm hoping for. She turned it over again. Not the practical reasons. Those are real, but they're not the whole of it. You don't have to read it to me, he said. I know. She looked at the darkening sky. That's almost worse, because it means I have to just say it. You can say it, he said quietly, in the tone she recognized from certain letters. The one that wasn't encouraging exactly, just stating a fact he believed. She sat with that for a moment. The cold had settled fully now, the April night doing what Kansas nights did, going from merely cold to making a point about it. She could see her breath. In the barn, one of the animals shifted, a low, familiar sound. I didn't come because I had nowhere else to go, she said. I didn't come because it seemed practical, or because you had good land, or because the shop situation resolved. I came because I spent a year reading your letters, and at some point, I don't know exactly when, it wasn't a single moment, I realized I was afraid. Not of coming, of not coming, of making a reasonable, safe, sensible decision to stay in Philadelphia and looking up in 10 years and knowing what I'd done. She looked at the letter in her hands. That's what this says, more or less. I was afraid to write it because it felt like too much to put on paper before I'd even arrived. The silence after that had a different quality than the silences before it. Well, Rowan said, after a moment. She glanced at him. Now you've arrived, he said. It was not a grand declaration. He didn't reach for her hand or say anything that would have played well in a theater. He just said it, now you've arrived, in the tone of someone closing a parenthesis that had been open for a long time, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest with a solidity that was almost physical. She turned the unsent letter over in her hands one more time. Then she set it on the porch railing and left it there. They sat together in the cold dark for another half hour, talking about ordinary things, the cattle, the kitchen garden, What she might want to do with the south room once she'd settled in, whether the stovepipe in that room drew well, or if he needed to look at it again. Small domestic specifics, the kind of conversation that builds a life from the ground up without making a ceremony of it. The unsent letter sat on the railing between them, unstirred by the wind, as if it had decided it had done enough work just by existing. Later, when she'd gone inside and he was banking the kitchen fire for the night, Rowan stood for a moment in the quiet of the house, his house, which had felt different from the moment she'd walked into it. Not dramatically different, not transformed, just no longer empty in the specific way it had been. And thought about the porch. 2 chairs. Both of them had been sitting in them tonight. He didn't make a production of that in his head. He just noted it, the way he noted practical things, things that had been planned for and had come to pass. Then he put out the lamp and went upstairs, and the house settled into the sounds a house makes at night. The creaks and small adjustments of a structure accommodating the weight of the people inside it. And outside the Kansas wind moved through the grass in the dark, indifferent and constant, the way it had been before any of this, and would be long after. And inside the house there was a light under the south-facing door at the end of the hall, faint and warm, where Eleanor Whitlock was sitting at the small table by the window, finally still, finally here, not writing anything at all. The first weeks were not easy, and neither of them pretended otherwise. This was, Eleanor thought, one of the better things about Rowan. He didn't have the reflex that a lot of people had, of smoothing difficulty over with optimism before the difficulty had been properly acknowledged. When something was hard, he said it was hard. When something wasn't working, he said that too. It was a quality she'd identified in his letters and had half wondered if it would survive the translation into actual daily life, where the pressures were different and the temptation to manage another person's comfort was more immediate. It survived. If anything, it was more pronounced in person, because in person there was no delay between the thought and the statement, no opportunity to edit toward palatability. The practical reality of frontier life arrived without ceremony in those first weeks, and it arrived specifically in the form of things Eleanor did not know how to do. She knew how to set type. She knew how to run a printing press, diagnose mechanical problems, manage accounts, negotiate with suppliers, and edit a sentence until it meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. She knew how to navigate a city, how to read a room, how to talk to difficult people without either capitulating or making enemies. These were real skills. None of them were immediately useful at 5 in the morning when the temperature had dropped overnight and the water in the kitchen cistern had a skim of ice on it and there was livestock to feed before anything else happened. The first morning she'd come downstairs to find Rowan already gone, out to the barn, she understood after a moment, because the barn door was open and there were boot tracks in the light frost on the yard. She'd stood in the kitchen in her coat and looked at the stove, which had gone out overnight, and felt the particular stupidity of not knowing how to do a simple thing. She knew fires. She'd lit fires in Philadelphia her whole life. But this stove had a specific character, a particular sequence of damper positions and draft adjustments, and she'd spent 20 minutes getting it wrong before she got it right. And by the time Rowan came in from the barn, the kitchen was warm, but her pride had taken a quiet dent. "I got the stove," she said, unnecessarily. He looked at it, then at her. "I usually leave it banked overnight," he said, not as a criticism, just as information. "Easier to restart. I should have shown you." "You should have," she agreed. "Show me now." He showed her. He was a good teacher. Specific, patient, without being condescending. The kind of patient that came from actually wanting the other person to understand rather than from performing tolerance. She learned quickly, which he acknowledged by not saying anything about it, which was also his way. There were things she was good at from the beginning. She had a systematic mind, and the ranch, she discovered, suffered from the organizational habits of a man who lived alone and kept most of the system in his head. Within the first 2 weeks, she'd created a written accounts ledger that actually tracked what was being spent and earned, organized the supply inventory in the root cellar, and identified 2 suppliers Rowan was overpaying because he'd never had time to shop around. He looked at what she'd done with the accounts book and was quiet for a long moment. "I've been doing this in my head," he said. "I know, it shows." He looked at her. "Not badly," she said. "You've kept it running, but it's easier to see where the problems are when it's written down." "How much are we losing on the grain supplier?" "About 12% over what Aino Makinen pays for the same grain, based on what he told me yesterday." Rowan looked up from the ledger. You talked to Ino. He came by to look at the fence line. We talked. She paused. He's less quiet than you suggested. He is with you, Rowan said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite jealousy and not quite amusement, and was probably a combination of both that he'd never admit to. Ino Makinen had arrived 3 days after Eleanor, ostensibly to check on a shared fence line, but transparently curious, in the Finnish way that expressed curiosity through extreme practical helpfulness rather than questions. He'd spent an afternoon fixing fence posts that didn't need fixing, and managed, in that time, to have a genuine conversation with Eleanor about typesetting, of all things, because it turned out his cousin in Helsinki worked in a print house, and he'd visited once and found the machinery interesting. Eleanor had liked him immediately. He'd nodded at Rowan on his way out with the particular expression that said, in Finnish and probably in every other language, well done. Hattie Brennan waited a full week, which for Hattie was restraint bordering on heroic, and then rode over on a Tuesday morning with a jar of apple butter and the transparent pretense of returning a borrowed pot she could easily have kept for another month. Eleanor opened the door, and Hattie looked at her for a moment with the frank appraisal of a woman who has been alone long enough to have stopped pretending she isn't curious. You're taller than I expected, Hattie said. Hello, said Eleanor. I'm Hattie Brennan. I'm the one who told him to put the chair story in his letter to you. She held out the apple butter. This is a gift and also a bribe for information. Eleanor took it. Come in, she said. I'll make coffee. Rowan, who was fixing something at the kitchen table with a hammer and a look of mild suffering, glanced up at Hattie and then at Eleanor with the expression of a man watching two forces of nature identify each other. Rowan, Hattie said. Hattie, he said. I'm going to talk to Eleanor now. You can stay or go. It's my kitchen. That didn't answer my question. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited, which was entirely characteristic. Eleanor was already at the stove with the coffee pot. Hattie watched her for a moment and then said to Rowan, quietly enough to be private, She knows what she's doing. Yes, Rowan said. You're not used to that. I'm used to it from letters. Letters and a person in your kitchen are different things. I'm finding that out, he said, which was honest enough that Hattie nodded in a satisfied way and stopped pressing. They had coffee. Hattie and Eleanor talked for 2 hours about things that ranged from practical frontier matters to politics, to the particular difficulties of being a woman who had opinions in a place where opinions were frequently managed for you, and Rowan said almost nothing and didn't appear to mind. And when Hattie finally left, she squeezed Eleanor's hand at the door and said, You'll be fine out here. Better than fine. How do you know? Eleanor asked. Because you asked me how I know instead of just saying thank you, Hattie said. Women who ask how I know are the ones who make it. The letter from Philadelphia came in May. Eleanor saw it in the mail batch Rowan brought back from town on a Thursday afternoon, her father's handwriting on the envelope, the familiar compressed script of a man who'd spent his life fitting words into small spaces. She took it from Rowan without a word and went to the south room with it, which had become her room in fact as well as assignment over the past weeks. The small table by the window now covered in the organized density of a working mind, books, a notebook she'd been filling with observations about the ranch's accounts and operations, 2 letters she was in the middle of writing to Philadelphia contacts about the possibility of a small local printing concern once she understood the community better. She sat at the table and opened the letter. Her father's handwriting was steadier than she'd feared. That was the first thing she noticed, and she felt a loosening in her shoulders that told her how tightly she'd been holding against the possibility of the alternative. He wrote, Eleanor, I've sold the shop. She stopped, read it again, then kept reading. Before you worry, Thomas will stay on. Hendricks made the purchase, and his first condition was keeping Thomas in place, which tells you something about how well you trained him. Your instincts about people have always been better than mine. The price was fair. Better than fair, honestly, and I've put aside what you'd have inherited anyway, so don't argue with me about that when you write back. I want to tell you something I should have said at the door when you left and didn't, because I am, as you know, not constructed for that kind of moment. I have been thinking since you left about what it costs a person to make a genuine choice. Not a choice made by elimination, not the choice that remains when all others close off, but a real choice made toward something. I watched your mother make 3 of those in her life, and I never told her how much I admired it. I'm telling you, what you did took more than I've given you credit for. The cat is well. The apartment is quiet. I've started reading in the evenings, which I never had time for before. Write when you can. Tell me about the prairie. I've been trying to picture it. Papa. She sat at the table for a long time after she'd finished reading. Outside the south window, the May afternoon was doing the extravagant thing that May afternoons did out here. The light going long and gold over the grass. The kind of light that made you understand why people had come to this place despite everything it cost them. She went downstairs. Rowan was in the kitchen, starting supper, and he looked up when she came in and read something in her face. Not alarm, just attention. The specific quality of attention he'd developed for her over the past weeks. The kind that didn't ask ahead of its time. He sold the shop, she said. Rowan set down what he was holding. Is he all right? He sounds better than all right, actually. She set the letter on the table between them. Thomas stays on. He got a fair price. He's reading in the evenings. She looked at the letter. He called what I did a genuine choice. My father doesn't say things like that. He just did, Rowan said. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I thought I'd feel relieved. I do feel relieved. But it's more complicated than that. It's the last thing that could have pulled me back is gone now. Which means I'm here, completely here, not provisionally. She looked up at him. I wanted you to know that's what this means. Not that the choice was ever provisional, but this makes it final, in a way it wasn't before. Rowan was quiet for a long moment, in the way that meant he was going to say something real rather than something reflexive. I've been thinking, he said, about the chair. Which chair? Both of them. He picked up the letter, not to read it again, but just to have something to hold for a moment, which she recognized as a gesture of his when he was working towards something difficult to say. I built that second chair before I knew you existed. I built it for a possibility, and I sat next to it empty for 2 years, and there were nights where I thought I'd built it for nothing, where the whole thing seemed like an embarrassing idea I'd inflicted on myself and on anyone who'd seen it. He set the letter down. I'm telling you this because I never told you. I said in a letter that the chair was waiting, and it was, but I didn't tell you what it costs to keep it waiting, what it takes to maintain a belief that something you want is worth keeping the space open for. She looked at him across the table. What does it take? She asked, though she thought she knew. Deciding, he said. Over and over. Not once. Every time you walk past it. Every time someone makes a joke about it. Every time a winter comes and you think, maybe I miscalculated. Maybe there's nobody coming. Maybe I built a chair for nothing. He met her eyes. I'm not telling you this for credit. I'm telling you because I think you did the same thing in Philadelphia, with your father, with the shop. You kept the space open while also doing what you had to do, and that's harder than just leaving. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, something moved in the barn, the horse shifting, the ordinary sound of an evening settling. I have a question, Eleanor said. All right. The first night, when I told you about the letter, the partner's offer, the thing I'd been carrying, you said it didn't change where we were. She watched him. What did you mean by where we are? We hadn't named anything yet. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She'd learned to tell the difference between his quiet of avoidance and his quiet of honesty that needed more time. I meant, he said, that whatever this is, it had already started, before you arrived, before you got on the train. It started in February of last year when I read a letter from a woman who started talking without a preamble. He paused. What it is specifically, what to call it, I haven't wanted to rush that. Because I think it matters to name a thing correctly, and I'd rather be slow and right than fast and wrong. What would you call it now? She said. If you had to. He looked at her steadily across the kitchen table. In the May evening light coming through the window she'd started thinking of as the kitchen window in the way you only thought of particular windows once the house had started to feel like yours. A beginning, he said. That's what I'd call it, a real one. She held that for a moment, testing its weight. That's honest, she said. I try, he said. The following weeks were the ones where the shape of things began to settle, not into anything finished, but into the recognizable outline of what they were building. Eleanor took over the household accounts completely, with Rowan's full agreement after she showed him 3 places where he'd been paying twice for things delivered once. She started a correspondence with the printer in the county seat about the possibility of a small local paper. Nothing immediate, just an idea she was testing against the reality of what the community needed and what she knew how to do. Rowan consulted her on decisions about the herd in a way that was genuine rather than performative, because she asked good questions, and her outsider perspective occasionally caught things his familiarity had made invisible. They disagreed regularly. This was, Eleanor privately thought, one of the better signs. They disagreed about the grain supplier. She wanted to switch immediately. He wanted to wait until the fall to avoid disrupting the relationship mid-season, and they argued about it for 20 minutes at the kitchen table in a conversation that was sharp and specific, and resolved in the end with a compromise that was probably better than either original position. They disagreed about a fence line along the northern pasture, about whether the kitchen garden needed expanding, about the correct way to manage a particular billing dispute with the feed store in town. Each disagreement was its own small proof of something, that neither of them shrank from the other, that neither of them performed agreement for the sake of peace. Hattie Brennan, who had made it her business to observe the situation with the thoroughness of a scientist and the investment of a friend, told Eleanor one afternoon in June, "You two argue like people who intend to keep talking to each other." "Is there another way to argue?" Eleanor asked. "Most people argue like they're trying to win," Hattie said. "You argue like you're trying to figure something out. That's different." The question of what to call things formally, the question that hung unspoken between them through April and May and into June, arrived not as a dramatic moment, but as a practical conversation on a Sunday morning when the weather was bad enough to keep them both inside, and they'd run out of indoor tasks and ended up at the kitchen table with coffee and the particular restlessness of 2 people who had been circling something long enough that circling it had become its own kind of tiredness. "Eleanor," Rowan said. "Rowan," she said back, in the tone that meant she knew what was coming, "I want to ask you something." "Then ask it." He looked at his coffee, then at her. "I'm not going to do this in a way that makes it into something larger than it is," he said, which was exactly what she would have hoped for and not quite what she'd expected. "But I also don't want to wait any longer because waiting has started feeling like a problem instead of a virtue. So, she said. "I'd like to marry you," he said, "if that's what you want. If you're ready. If you're not ready, I can wait. I'm good at waiting, as you've observed." The corner of his mouth moved, though I'd prefer not to. She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had built a house for a possibility and sat next to an empty chair for 2 years and written letters that said exactly what he meant without decoration, and driven 14 miles in a cold April morning to pick up a woman he'd never met because she'd said she was coming and he believed her. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He nodded. Not the nod of a man who was unsurprised, but the nod of a man who had been hoping for a specific answer and had received it and was giving himself a moment to let that be real. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. And then he reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over so their palms were together, and they sat like that in the Sunday morning quiet while the rain came down on the Kansas prairie and the 2 chairs on the porch got wet, and neither of them went to move them inside, because for once the weather could do what it wanted and it wouldn't matter at all. Show more. They were married in July, on a Thursday, because Thursday was the day the circuit judge came through Millhaven, and neither of them saw any reason to wait for a more symbolic occasion. The ceremony took place in the judge's temporary office above the grain elevator, which smelled of dust and old paper and the particular dry heat of a Kansas July, and lasted 11 minutes, including the time it took the judge to find his reading glasses. Hattie Brennan was there. Aino Makinen was there, standing very straight in a coat that was too warm for the weather and looking solemn in the way that Finns look solemn, which was not unhappy but was serious about the weight of things. The Dowd brothers from the feed store were not there, which was fine. Nobody had invited them. Eleanor wore the better of her 2 good dresses, which was dark blue and had been purchased in Philadelphia for occasions that had turned out to be less significant than this one. Rowan wore a clean shirt and his good coat and had gotten his hair cut the previous Tuesday, which Eleanor noticed and didn't mention because mentioning it would have embarrassed him, and she had learned by July which things to mention and which to simply register. The judge asked them the questions. They answered them. He pronounced them married in the flat, practical tone of a man who had done this many times and considered it important work despite the lack of ceremony, which Eleanor respected. Hattie cried a little, which she would later deny. Eno shook Rowan's hand with both of his, which was as close as Ino got to a speech. Afterward, they went back to the house, and Eleanor made supper, and Rowan fixed the loose board on the porch step that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks, and that was the wedding day. It was not romantic in any way that would make a good story at a party. It was exactly what both of them had wanted, which was a thing done honestly, without performance, in the middle of a Thursday that then continued being a Thursday. The first winter they were married was the hardest winter Harlan County had seen in 6 years. It started early. The first real snow came in October, which was not unheard of but wasn't welcome, and by November it was clear that this was not going to be a manageable winter but the other kind, the kind that the frontier held in reserve to remind people of the terms of the arrangement. The temperature dropped in the second week of November and stayed dropped. The creek froze solid enough to walk on by December 1st. The cattle required twice the usual feeding, which meant twice the usual labor in conditions that made every task take 3 times as long. Eleanor learned things about herself that winter that she wouldn't have learned any other way. She learned that she was stronger physically than she'd believed, not in any dramatic sense, but in the sustained, grinding way that mattered on the frontier, the ability to keep doing the necessary thing when cold and tired and done with doing it. She learned that she had a tolerance for difficulty that surprised her, possibly because the difficulty was her own, and she'd chosen it, which changed its character entirely compared to difficulties that had simply landed on her. She learned that she and Rowan had a specific way of moving through hard stretches together, not by encouraging each other in the way people encouraged each other in stories, with speeches and rallying cries, but by the quiet mutual acknowledgement of what needed doing and then doing it side by side without making it larger than it was. The worst night was in January. A storm came in fast, the kind that appeared on the horizon as a solid gray wall and arrived within an hour, and the temperature with the wind was the kind of cold that had genuine intent behind it. Rowan had gone out to the barn at nightfall to check on the cattle and hadn't come back when he should have, and Eleanor stood at the kitchen window for 20 minutes watching the white dark outside before she put on every layer she owned and went out after him. She found him in the barn, which was not lost. He hadn't been lost, the barn was 40 yards from the house. But the latch on the main door had frozen solid from the outside, and he'd been working on it with bare hands because he'd lost a glove somewhere in the dark, and his hands were white and bad-looking in the lamplight. "Why didn't you yell?" she said. "I didn't want to—" "Don't say you didn't want to worry me," she said, taking his hands and pulling them inside her coat against her sides, which was warmer than anything else she had available, and also hurt him from the sudden temperature change, which he didn't say. "That's a completely useless reason, and you know it." "I was going to get it open," he said, through teeth he was trying not to clench. "Your hands are white, Rowan." "They're fine." "They are not fine." She held them tighter against her sides. "When you can't get somewhere, you yell. That is the rule I am making right now, and I need you to agree to it." He was quiet for a moment, which in the circumstances was not his processing quiet, but his accepting something quiet. "All right," he said. "Say it like you mean it." "I mean it," he said. And she believed him because he didn't say things he didn't mean, which was one of the foundational facts of being with him. She got the door open with a piece of iron bar she found inside the barn, working at the frozen latch for 10 minutes while he held the lamp and his hands recovered enough to be useful. They got back to the house together, and she made him sit by the stove while she heated water and checked his fingers, which were painful but not damaged. And he sat there with the look of a man who found being looked after difficult and was doing his best to be gracious about it. "You went out after me," he said after a while. "Of course I did." "In that storm. You were gone too long." She set down the cloth she'd been using and looked at him. "I didn't cross the country to sit by a window and wonder." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd come to recognize over the months, the one that appeared when she'd said something that confirmed something he'd hoped was true but hadn't been entirely sure of. He reached over and took her hand, which was still cold from outside, and held it without saying anything. "You could say thank you," she offered. "Thank you," he said. "Though technically this whole situation is your fault for making a rule I should have had before you arrived." "You're welcome," she said, and he almost smiled. and the storm went on outside and the stove was warm, and they stayed like that until the worst of the night had passed. Spring came the way it always did on the prairie, not gently, but with the blunt insistence of a season that had been waiting long enough. The snow pulled back, the creek thawed and ran high and loud for 2 weeks, and the grass came up green in a way that never quite got ordinary no matter how many times you'd seen it, green in a color that seemed to mean something beyond itself after months of white and brown. Eleanor's printing idea, which had been corresponding and waiting through the winter, became real in March. It started smaller than she'd originally envisioned. Not a newspaper, not yet, but a community circular, 4 pages, produced twice a month on a used press she'd negotiated for through the printer in the county seat. She set up in a corner of the front room with Rowan's agreement and the arrangement that she would move everything if he needed the space, which he never required her to do because he reorganized his own storage to make the corner work without mentioning he'd done it, which she discovered on her own and chose not to comment on because some kindnesses were received better quietly. The first issue of what she called the Harlan County Circular came out in April, 1 year after she'd arrived in Millhaven on a train with a brown bag and too many books. It was 4 pages of community information, land prices, weather observations, notices of meetings and transactions, a brief piece she'd written herself about the winter's effect on the cattle herds, and what it suggested about feed planning for the following year. She printed 60 copies, and Rowan distributed them on his supply run to town. By the second issue, she had more material than she could fit in 4 pages. By the summer, she was printing 8 pages. By fall, the county's 2 largest landowners had placed regular notices, which covered most of the cost of the paper, and she'd started a letters section that turned out to be the most read part of the whole publication, because it turned out that frontier people, who were often isolated by distance and weather and the sheer labor of surviving, had a great deal they wanted to say to each other and had not previously had a place to say it. Hattie Brennan wrote a letter to the second issue about water rights that generated 4 response letters and a meeting at the Dowd Brothers feed store that resolved a property dispute that had been simmering for 3 years. Eleanor reported on the meeting in the 3rd issue, and Gerald Dowd, who had laughed about the empty chair 4 years ago until he'd nearly choked on his coffee, came to her afterward and said, with the slightly pained expression of a man being fair against his preferences, "That was good coverage. Accurate. I was a typesetter for 12 years, Eleanor said. Accuracy is a professional habit." "Yeah, well," Gerald said, "it's useful out here." She told Rowan about it that evening on the porch, where they ended most evenings when the weather allowed it, which had become a habit she hadn't planned and wouldn't trade. He listened with the particular quality of attention she'd come to rely on, not just hearing but actually taking it in, storing it alongside everything else he knew about her. "Gerald Dowd gave you a compliment," he said. "He did." "And?" "And I received it graciously," she said, "and did not mention that he thought your 2 chairs were evidence of mental instability." Rowan looked at the chairs. "He wasn't entirely wrong," he said. "It was an unusual thing to do." "It was," Eleanor agreed. "I'm glad you did it." He looked at her. "So am I," he said. "Most days." "Most days?" "The January storm," he said. "I'd have heated the barn less efficiently alone." She laughed, the real laugh, the one she hadn't known she'd stopped having in Philadelphia until she'd started having it again out here. He watched her laugh with the expression he had when she did that, which was not the expression of a man performing appreciation, but of a man who was simply glad for the specific fact of her, in the unshowy way he was glad for most things he valued. Daniel Whitlock came to visit in the second autumn. He'd written in August saying he was thinking about it, and Eleanor had written back saying, "Come," and he'd arrived in September on the same train she'd arrived on, though he had less luggage and significantly more opinions about the train's seating arrangements. He was thinner than when she'd last seen him and moved more carefully, but his eyes were sharp and his handwriting, in the most recent letters, had been steadier, and when he stepped off the platform at Millhaven and saw Eleanor waiting with the wagon, his face did the thing it almost never did, which was open completely. She hugged him on the platform. He hugged back, the same as the morning she'd left, briefly and fiercely, the hug of a man who felt things deeply and was embarrassed by it. "You look well," he said, holding her at arm's length and looking. "I am well," she said, and meant it without qualification. which was not a thing she'd been able to say about herself in Philadelphia for several years before she'd left. Rowan shook Daniel's hand at the wagon, and Daniel looked at him with the careful assessment of a man who had been withholding judgment for 18 months and was now prepared to deliver it. The judgment took the form of a single nod, brief and definitive, which Eleanor understood, and Rowan, who had experience with taciturn men through Eino Makinen, understood also. Daniel stayed 2 weeks. He and Rowan, who had almost nothing in common on the surface, developed a functional working relationship based primarily on the fact that both of them were most comfortable when they had something to do, and Rowan always had something to do, and Daniel turned out to be more useful with his hands than anyone had expected, including Daniel. He rebuilt the front gate latch that had been sticking since spring, and did something to the kitchen stove that made it draw 20% better, neither of which he mentioned, which Rowan noticed and respected. In the evenings, they all three sat on the porch. Daniel looked at the prairie in the particular way of a man encountering something genuinely outside his prior experience, and being honest enough not to have already decided what he thought of it. "It's very large," he said one evening. "Yes," Rowan said. "The letters didn't... I understood it from the letters, but it's different when you're in it." "Most things are," Rowan said. Daniel looked at his daughter, who was sitting in the second chair with her feet up on the porch railing in a posture that would have been unlikely in the woman who'd left Philadelphia 18 months ago. Something in it, loose, unhurried, at home, that told him more than anything else she might have said. She said once, Daniel told Rowan, when she was about 14, that she wanted to own her own time. I didn't know what to do with that then. I thought it was an impractical thing to want. He was quiet for a moment. I was wrong about that. Rowan looked at Eleanor, who was looking at the horizon with the expression she had when she was thinking and not particularly trying to hide it. She does, Rowan said. Her time is her own. Daniel nodded slowly. I see that. He looked at the land again. I see a lot of things I didn't expect to see. The letter that completed the circle, the one that closed what had been open since February of 1878, was not dramatic in its arrival. It came in with the regular mail on an October morning, a year and a half after Eleanor had first stepped off the train at Millhaven, and it was from Thomas Garrett in Philadelphia, writing on the shop's letterhead, which now read Hendricks and Garrett Printing, because Thomas had been made a junior partner at 21, which was a thing Eleanor had predicted to Rowan, and he had quietly bet on. Thomas wrote to tell her the shop was running well. He wrote to tell her that her father had come by twice that month, not for any business reason, but apparently just to watch the press run, and that both times he'd pointed out a small inefficiency in Thomas's compositing process that Thomas had then corrected and found was actually an improvement, and that he'd left both times apparently satisfied. He wrote to tell her that a woman had come in asking about typesetting work, a young woman who reminded him, he said, a little of what Eleanor had described of her own younger self, stubborn, fast, certain she already knew more than she did, and that he'd hired her on the strength of that resemblance and was fairly confident he'd be glad he did. He ended the letter. I think you left the shop in good hands. I think you knew you were, and that's why you left. I just wanted you to know that the good hands are still here, and so is everything you built, and you don't need to worry about it anymore. You should probably stop worrying about it if you haven't already. Though knowing you, you probably haven't entirely, so stop. Eleanor read this at the kitchen table and laughed, and Rowan looked up from what he was doing and raised an eyebrow. Thomas says to stop worrying about the shop, she said. Are you still worrying about the shop? A little, she admitted, less than I was. What would it take to stop entirely? She thought about it honestly. Time, she said, and evidence. Thomas is providing the evidence. Time is doing the rest. Rowan went back to what he was doing, which was reviewing the fall accounts she'd prepared, marking questions in the margin in his careful handwriting. She watched him for a moment, the bent head, the concentrated quiet, the absolute lack of performance in everything he did, and felt something she'd been feeling increasingly over the months, and still didn't have a word precise enough for. Not happiness, exactly, or not only happiness, which was too simple for what it actually was. Something more like the satisfaction of having made a true thing, of having aimed at something real and found that it was, in fact, real. She went back to her own work. Outside, the October wind was moving through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, Aino Meikonen was repairing something with the methodical patience of a man who believed in doing things correctly. And Hattie Brennan was probably on her porch with her apple butter and her opinions, and the Harlan County Circular had a print run of 240 copies this month, and her father was watching a press run in Philadelphia with the quietly critical eye of a man who couldn't quite leave something he'd built, even when he'd sold it. Life accumulated like that. Not in moments of arrival, but in the steady layering of ordinary days, each one slightly worn down at the edges, slightly imperfect in some specific way, adding up to something that was only visible from a certain distance. She understood this better now than she had in Philadelphia, where the pace had been too fast and the noise too constant to see the accumulation clearly. Out here, where the distances were real and the quiet had weight, you could actually see what you were building while you built it. Years passed. The Harlan County Circular became eventually the Harlan County Gazette, 8 pages weekly, with a readership that extended into 3 neighboring counties, and a letters section that had generated 2 resolved land disputes, 1 prevented water rights lawsuit, and a marriage between a widow outside of Millhaven and a farmer 20 miles east who had read her letter about crop rotation and written back to argue about it, which Eleanor considered one of her finest editorial achievements. Their daughter arrived in 1881, and she was named Clara because Eleanor had always liked the name and Rowan had no objection, and she had her father's stillness and her mother's refusal to accept an imprecise answer, which was a formidable combination in a small child and promised to be interesting in an adult. Their son came 3 years later, quieter than Clara, interested in the land in a specific and early way that Rowan recognized and Eleanor observed with the attention she gave to things she didn't yet fully understand. The house grew with them, not dramatically, not in the way of ambition, but practically, the way things grew when they were actually being lived in. A second bookshelf, a proper writing desk for Eleanor in the front room, a room added off the back for the children, built by Rowan and Aino over 2 summers in the same methodical way that everything Rowan built was built. Each piece fitted with the assumption that it would need to last. Gerald Dowd died in 1886, which grieved his brother Pete genuinely, and surprised no one by how much community it drew to the funeral, because Gerald, who had been loud and occasionally insufferable, had also been present for every hard winter and every drought year, and presence counted for something out here, regardless of how it was packaged. Hattie Brennan was there, and Eleanor sat beside her in the church, and afterward Hattie said, "He was a better man than his mouth suggested." "Most people are," Eleanor said. "Not all," Hattie said, in the tone of a woman with specific evidence. "No," Eleanor agreed, "not all. Aino Mäkinen's cousin came from Finland in 1887 and stayed, and turned out to have an opinion about typesetting that kept Eleanor in an interesting argument for most of a winter, conducted partly in English and partly in notes passed through Aino, who translated with the patience of a man accustomed to standing in the middle of things. Daniel Whitlock made 2 more visits. The second time, in 1885, he was slower than before, and leaned on a cane he'd resisted for 2 years before accepting, and he spent most of his time on the porch in one of the 2 chairs, watching the prairie with the expression of a man who had made a certain peace with not understanding something. On the last evening before he went back, he sat with Rowan while Eleanor put the children to bed, and Rowan sat beside him in the other chair and didn't feel required to fill the silence, which Daniel appreciated. "She's happy," Daniel said eventually, not as a question. "Yes," Rowan said. "She wasn't before, in Philadelphia." He was quiet for a moment. "She was capable and she was working and she was managing, but she wasn't happy. I knew it. I don't think I let myself know it fully, because it would have required me to do something about it and I didn't know what to do." He looked at his hands. "She did something about it herself." "She did," Rowan said. "You built a good house," Daniel said. Rowan looked at the house. The frame and the windows and the porch with its 2 chairs and the lamplight coming through the kitchen window, where Eleanor was reading Clara, a story about something Clara was clearly arguing with, based on the sound of it. "I built a structure," he said. "She helped build the house." Daniel made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to it. Then he nodded, once, with the finality that meant he'd decided something was true and was done deciding it. He died the following spring, which was not unexpected and was still its own kind of loss. The specific loss of a person who has been complicated to love and whom you love anyway, which left a different kind of absence than simpler losses. Eleanor cried, which she did privately and in full. And then she wrote a piece for the Gazette about the print trade and what it made of people, and she did not put her father in it by name, but everyone who knew her understood what she was honoring, and Hattie Brennan told her afterward that it was the finest thing she'd written. The years settled. The children grew. Clara did prove interesting. The son, whose name was William, but who was called Will from the time he could object to anything, took over the management of the North Pasture at 15, with a confidence his father watched with recognition and his mother watched with a certain anxious pride that she mostly kept to herself. The community around them had grown too. Not into a city, nothing like that, but into the denser thing that happens when enough people have come through enough winters together. Neighbors who had once been only names in the Gazette were also people who showed up when something broke, who shared seed when seed ran short, who understood without being told that the arithmetic of survival on the frontier was communal, whether anyone had formally decided it was or not. Eleanor had written about that in the Gazette more than once, in pieces that she later thought were the truest things she'd managed to put on paper. The way that isolation, when it was shared, eventually stopped being isolation and became something else. On an evening in the fall of 1892, 14 years after Rowan had placed an advertisement in 3 newspapers looking for an equal willing to build a meaningful life, and 14 years and 5 months after Eleanor had started talking without a preamble in a letter that had changed the direction of 2 lives, they sat on the porch after supper in the 2 chairs that had been replaced once and repaired several times, but were still, in some essential way, the same chairs. The prairie was doing what it did in September, going golden and vast in the last light, the grass moving in long, slow waves that Eleanor had learned to love in the specific way you learn to love things that had no interest in being loved, that simply were what they were. Clara was inside reading something she'd argue about at breakfast. Will was in the barn with the particular focused attention that meant he'd found something he wanted to fix. From somewhere down the road came the faint sound of Aino Makinen doing something practical in the fading light. "Rowan," Eleanor said. Do you ever think about the advertisement?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave things that deserved it. "Sometimes," he said. "Why?" She looked at the horizon. "I was thinking about what I'd have written back if I'd been on your side. If I'd been the one placing it." She paused. "I don't think I'd have been as honest as you were. I think I'd have tried to make it sound more reasonable, more practical, less like a man who'd built a chair for nobody in particular." "It worked out," he said. "It did," she said. "Though it wasn't a strategy, you were just telling the truth about what you wanted." "I didn't know another way to do it." She looked at him, at the profile she knew as well now as she knew anything, the lines that had deepened over 14 years, the gray at his temples that had appeared in his mid-40s and which he'd never once remarked on. He was looking at the prairie with the particular quality of attention she'd understood eventually was not detachment but the opposite, the attention of a man who loved something and didn't feel the need to announce it constantly. "That's the thing," she said. "That's the thing I think about." "What is?" "That you didn't know another way." She turned back to the horizon. "Most people do know another way. Most people use it. The other way is easier and it gets worse results, and almost everyone chooses it because worse results are better than the risk of telling the truth about what you want and not getting it." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You told the truth too," he said. "In your first letter, you walked in talking." "I did," she said. "So we were both idiots in the same direction," he said. And she laughed, the real laugh, the one that had come back out here and stayed. The light was going now. The prairie going from gold to copper to the deep blue that preceded dark, and the wind had dropped the way it sometimes did at this hour, the grass going still, and there was a moment, not a dramatic one, not the kind that announced itself, where everything was simply what it was, and that was enough, and they both knew it was enough. The 2 chairs sat side by side on the porch of a house that had been built for a future its builder hadn't yet seen, and both of them were full. That was the whole of it. That was what all of it had been for. Not the happy ending of a story that had decided to be simple, but the real end of a real thing. 2 imperfect people who had told the truth, held a space open against the pressure of doubt, done the necessary work, disagreed, failed small failures and recovered from them, and arrived, by those specific means and no others, at a life that was genuinely theirs. The prairie darkened. The house behind them went warm with lamplight, and the chairs, worn and steady on the weathered boards of the porch, held the weight of two people who had chosen, over and over, to stay.